I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted, and when their lawyer read the final sentence out loud, his voice stopped mid-breath. The conference room at Cole & Whitman sat high above downtown Hartford, all glass walls and polished oak, the late morning sun spilling across the long table where Daniel and Claire Whitmore waited with barely concealed impatience. Margaret Whitmore sat at the far end, her back straight against the leather chair, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her hands folded calmly over a navy handbag she had carried for nearly 20 years. At 72, she had learned that silence unsettled people more than anger ever could. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, already speaking about streamlining assets and modern leadership, phrases he had repeated for months as if they were acts of devotion instead of ambition. Claire, immaculate in a cream blazer that probably cost more than Margaret's first car, offered a tight smile and reassured the attorney that this transition would be best for everyone involved. They spoke as though Margaret were no longer in the room, as though her name were already engraved in the past tense. Outside, traffic hummed along Main Street, steady and indifferent, while inside the air felt thin with expectation. For 43 years Margaret and her late husband Edward had built Whitmore Industrial Supply from a 2-truck operation into a regional distributor worth several $1 million. A company that employed over 100 families across Connecticut and western Massachusetts. After Edward's passing 18 months earlier, Daniel had insisted he was ready to take full control, that his father would have wanted it that way, that Margaret deserved to rest. Rest, she had noticed, was a polite word people used when they meant step aside. 3 days earlier, an envelope had arrived at her home, a sprawling 4,200 square foot colonial they had paid off long ago, and inside were documents Daniel claimed were routine updates. Routine, except the language had shifted. Small phrases tucked between paragraphs about fiduciary responsibility and temporary authority. Margaret had read every line at her kitchen table beneath the brass light fixture Edward once installed himself, and she had remembered his voice telling her never to ignore the fine print. That memory had been steady, not sentimental, and it had guided her hand as she called her own attorney and requested one additional clause be drafted into the final version of the estate plan. Now, as Mr. Harrison Cole cleared his throat and began to read, Daniel's foot tapped against the carpet with barely restrained eagerness. Claire glanced at her phone once, then set it face down, confident that by lunchtime the Whitmore fortune would be firmly within reach. Margaret did not look at either of them. She watched the attorney instead, watched the subtle tightening around his eyes as he reached the final page, watched the moment his cadence faltered and his gaze lifted from the document to meet hers. In that suspended second, before a single protest could form, the illusion of victory began to crack, and the heirs who believed they had orchestrated every outcome suddenly realized they had never been the only ones reading the paperwork. 72 hours earlier the house on Hawthorne Lane had been unusually quiet, the kind of silence that settled into corners and stayed there long after sunset. Margaret Whitmore had been standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she and Edward once argued about paint colors and laughed about late invoices, when Daniel's email arrived with the subject line marked urgent signature required. She had poured herself a cup of coffee and carried her reading glasses to the long maple table that still bore faint scratches from decades of family dinners. Outside the window the early autumn wind moved through the trees, scattering red and gold leaves across the wide front lawn, a lawn Edward used to measure carefully each spring before seeding it himself. The message from Daniel had been polite but brisk, explaining that the board needed her approval to adjust temporary executive authority, so that business operations could continue smoothly. He had written that it was standard procedure, and that she should not worry about the details. Margaret had learned long ago that whenever someone insisted she should not worry about the details were exactly where the truth lived. She printed the attached documents and spread them across the table, smoothing each page with deliberate patience. The language was formal, filled with references to fiduciary duty and administrative efficiency. Yet tucked between those familiar phrases were subtle changes that shifted control in ways Edward had never intended. A clause extended Daniel's authority beyond interim leadership. Another referenced asset consolidation that would allow property to be reclassified under a holding entity she did not recognize. Margaret traced the lines with the tip of her pen, remembering how Edward used to read contracts aloud to her in the evenings, explaining every paragraph until she could recite the numbers by heart. He had trusted her judgment, and she had never signed anything without understanding the last sentence. That afternoon she called Leonard Hayes, the retired accountant who had worked with their company for nearly 3 decades. Leonard arrived before dinner, his gray sedan pulling into the driveway as the sky turned a pale Connecticut blue. He removed his hat when he stepped inside, a gesture from another generation, and sat with her at the table while reviewing the paperwork. His expression shifted from neutral to concerned as he compared the attachments with the original trust documents Edward had filed years earlier. He did not raise his voice, but he did say that the revisions would effectively reduce Margaret's voting power to ceremonial status. He mentioned that Claire had recently inquired about assisted living communities in the area, framing it as forward planning. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face calm, her hands resting lightly on the papers. She did not accuse and she did not speculate. Instead, she thanked Leonard for his honesty and asked him to connect her with an estate attorney who specialized in protective clauses. After Leonard left, she walked slowly through the house, pausing in Edward's study where his leather chair still faced the window overlooking the backyard. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. She ran her fingers along the shelf that held framed photographs of Daniel as a boy, grinning beside a small fishing boat on Lake Warramog, long before ambition replaced gratitude. Margaret understood then that what Daniel and Claire wanted was control, not responsibility, and she realized that sometimes the most effective way to confront greed was not to block it but to give it exactly the shape it demanded. That evening Margaret drove to West Hartford to meet the attorney Leonard had recommended, a quiet woman named Patricia Ellison whose office overlooked a narrow street lined with brick storefronts and early 19th century buildings. The air had turned crisp, and the sidewalks were scattered with leaves that crunched under Margaret's sensible heels as she stepped inside. Patricia did not waste time with pleasantries. She reviewed the documents in silence, occasionally adjusting her glasses, then asked Margaret a simple question about intent. Did she want to protect the company, the estate, or the lesson? Margaret considered the wording carefully because she understood that each objective required a different structure. She answered that she wanted the truth to reveal itself without her raising her voice. Patricia nodded as though she had heard that answer before from women who had spent decades being underestimated. Together they examined the original trust Edward had established, noting its emphasis on stewardship and long-term responsibility rather than immediate liquidation. Patricia explained that there was a legal instrument often overlooked, a clause that activated consequences when undue influence or coercion could be demonstrated. It was rarely dramatic on paper, but it was decisive when invoked. Margaret listened as Patricia outlined how such a provision could be embedded in an updated estate plan, without altering the visible distribution percentages. The heirs would see what they expected to see, but a single condition would govern whether they kept it. Margaret felt no surge of triumph, only a steady clarity. She signed the retainer agreement with a hand that did not tremble and instructed Patricia to draft the revision immediately. The following afternoon Daniel and Claire arrived at Hawthorne Lane for dinner, bringing a bottle of wine and the familiar tone of rehearsed concern. Claire complimented the house, remarking that 4,000 square feet was far too much space for one person, and that downsizing could free up capital for strategic growth. Daniel spoke about expansion plans and how modernizing leadership would honor his father's legacy. Margaret served roast chicken and green beans on the same white china she had used for years, moving through the kitchen with unhurried grace. She did not challenge their assumptions. She asked polite questions about quarterly projections, and listened as Daniel described potential investors who preferred streamlined authority. Claire mentioned that she had toured a retirement community in Farmington, emphasizing the amenities and convenience, as if she were describing a resort. Margaret noted every word, storing each detail the way she once stored invoices in supplier contracts. After dessert Daniel produced the revised documents, explaining that they only required her signature to formalize the transition. Margaret accepted the folder and placed it beside her plate without opening it. She told them she would review everything carefully and schedule a meeting with the family attorney. Within the week, Daniel's smile tightened at the edges, and Claire's gaze sharpened for a fraction of a second before softening again. They left believing momentum was on their side. When the door closed behind them, Margaret carried the folder to Edward's study and set it on his old oak desk. The house felt still but not lonely. She understood that the coming days would test more than loyalty. They would test character, and she intended to let that test unfold exactly as written. The next morning Margaret returned to Patricia Ellison's office with a quiet determination that felt less like anger and more like alignment. The draft of the revised estate plan lay inside a simple manila folder, its language precise and unembellished, the power hidden in a single conditional paragraph that did not announce itself with bold print or dramatic phrasing. Patricia reviewed the final wording once more, explaining that the clause would activate automatically if any beneficiary attempted coercion, misrepresentation, or manipulation for personal gain. It did not require a courtroom spectacle. It required evidence, and evidence had a way of surfacing when people believed they were untouchable. Margaret signed the documents in blue ink, her signature steady, the same signature that had once appeared on supply contracts and payroll approvals for over 100 employees. Patricia arranged for the updated version to be filed and coordinated with Harrison Cole's office for the formal reading, framing it as a routine consolidation of Edward's estate. That afternoon Margaret drove back to Hawthorne Lane, passing the small diner where Edward used to meet truck drivers at 6 in the morning, and the hardware store where they had opened their first line of credit decades earlier. Memory did not weaken her. It reminded her that the company had been built on patience and integrity, not entitlement. By the time Daniel called that evening to confirm the meeting with Harrison Cole, Margaret's voice carried no trace of tension. She told him she was grateful he had taken initiative, and that she looked forward to formalizing everything. Daniel sounded relieved, almost buoyant, and Claire could be heard in the background asking whether the paperwork would be finalized before the next board session. Margaret ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the entryway table beneath a framed photograph of Daniel at age 10. Standing proudly beside his father at a company picnic. She wondered when confidence had shifted into presumption. 2 days later she arrived at the law office 10 minutes early, dressed in a tailored gray suit Edward once said made her look formidable. She greeted Harrison Cole with courteous warmth and thanked him for facilitating the update. Daniel and Claire entered moments later, carrying an air of quiet celebration, as though the outcome had already been printed and sealed. They spoke about future expansion into New York markets and restructuring executive compensation packages, outlining plans that assumed control was imminent. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally, allowing them the comfort of their own projections. When Patricia handed Harrison the finalized packet, there was no visible difference from the earlier draft Daniel had reviewed at dinner. The distribution percentages remained intact, the company shares allocated as expected, the property titles unchanged on the surface. What had changed was a single condition embedded near the end, a sentence that shifted inheritance from privilege to accountability. As Harrison began reading aloud, the room settled into a polite stillness. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and watched the sunlight move across the polished table, knowing that the true weight of the document would not be felt until the final line was spoken. The final sentence did not sound dramatic when Harrison Cole first began to read it, and that was precisely why it carried such force. His voice moved steadily through the formal language until it reached the conditional clause near the end of the document, and then the cadence shifted, almost imperceptibly, as he articulated each word with deliberate clarity. The provision stated that any beneficiary who attempted to exert coercion, misrepresentation, or undue influence over the grantor for the purpose of accelerating control or consolidating assets would immediately forfeit all rights to inheritance, with the forfeited share redirected to the Whitmore Community Foundation, a charitable trust Edward had quietly established years earlier. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. Daniel's expression changed first, the confident ease draining from his face as though someone had lowered the lights. Claire leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, and asked Harrison to repeat the clause. Harrison did, slower this time, the words landing one by one with the calm authority of written law. Margaret remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady on the attorney rather than on her son. Daniel attempted a measured response, suggesting that such language was unnecessary because no one had applied pressure. His tone was careful, but the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. Patricia Ellison, seated beside Margaret, gently referenced the recent requests for expedited signatures, the inquiries into reclassifying property, and the documented discussions about limiting Margaret's voting authority. She did not accuse. She cited timelines and correspondence. Claire insisted that those conversations had been strategic planning, nothing more. Margaret finally spoke, her voice composed and even, explaining that strategic planning did not require secrecy or haste, and that stewardship was not the same as displacement. She reminded Daniel that the company bore his father's name not as a trophy, but as a responsibility. The silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice. Harrison continued reading the remaining pages, confirming that the distribution percentages remained unchanged provided that all conduct aligned with the fiduciary standards outlined in the clause. If those standards were breached, the assets would transition irrevocably to the foundation, funding vocational scholarships and small business grants across Connecticut. Daniel leaned back in his chair, absorbing the implications, while Claire's earlier certainty gave way to calculation. Margaret did not gloat. She did not need to. The document had transformed inheritance from entitlement into accountability, and the burden of proof now rested on behavior, rather than expectation. When the reading concluded, Harrison placed the papers neatly on the table and asked if there were any questions. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, recognizing that protest would only draw attention to intent. Margaret gathered her handbag and stood, offering a polite nod to both attorneys. She told Daniel that leadership was not something one claimed through paperwork alone, and that trust, once strained, required demonstration rather than assumption. As she walked toward the door, the afternoon light reflected off the glass walls of the conference room, and for the first time since Edward's passing, control felt balanced not by dominance, but by clarity. When Margaret stepped out of the law office into the cool Hartford afternoon, the city felt unchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The traffic lights blinked in steady rhythm, pedestrians crossed Main Street with coffee cups in hand, and the world continued as though inheritance had never been questioned inside a glass conference room. Daniel and Claire followed several paces behind her, their earlier confidence replaced with a tight, measured silence. In the parking garage, Daniel attempted to regain control of the narrative, suggesting that the clause was merely a precaution, and that they would, of course, demonstrate their loyalty through proper conduct. Claire added that transparency had always been their intention, that perhaps there had been misunderstandings in communication. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression calm, her tone unhurried when she responded. She explained that trust was not rebuilt through assurances, but through consistent action, and that leadership required patience rather than urgency. She reminded Daniel that his father had never rushed a decision that carried long-term consequences, even when expansion opportunities promised immediate profit. The words were not accusatory. They were factual. Daniel nodded, though the tension in his jaw suggested he was recalculating rather than reflecting. Over the next several days, Margaret observed subtle changes. Emails that once demanded immediate signatures now arrived with careful phrasing and complete attachments. Board meeting agendas included her in full detail rather than as a courtesy copy. Claire, who had previously spoken about downsizing as though it were inevitable, shifted her tone to emphasize comfort and preference rather than necessity. Margaret did not confront these adjustments. She documented them. Patricia advised her to maintain records of every communication, not as ammunition but as evidence of alignment or deviation from the fiduciary standard. Meanwhile, the Whitmore Community Foundation paperwork was finalized quietly, its charter outlining scholarships for vocational students and seed grants for small manufacturing startups across Connecticut. The foundation was structured to activate seamlessly should the forfeiture clause ever be triggered, ensuring that the company's value would circulate back into the community Edward once served. Margaret spent an afternoon walking through the warehouse facility on the outskirts of town, greeting employees by name, listening to supervisors discuss supply chain forecasts and equipment upgrades. She wanted them to understand that stewardship still existed at the top, that stability had not been surrendered. Daniel accompanied her, speaking respectfully, aware that every gesture now carried weight. The dynamic had changed. Control no longer rested on assumption. It rested on conduct. At home that evening, Margaret sat in Edward's study and reviewed the latest quarterly report, noting areas of growth and areas requiring discipline. She felt neither vindictive nor triumphant. What she felt was equilibrium. The clause had not stripped Daniel of inheritance. It had given him a choice. And for the first time since Edward's passing, Margaret understood that the greatest protection she could offer the legacy was not resistance, but a standard so clear that only integrity could satisfy it. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm inside Whitmore Industrial Supply began to reveal what policy alone could not. Margaret maintained her presence at the office 3 mornings each week, arriving before 8 o'clock, walking the warehouse floor with the quiet authority of someone who knew the weight of every shipment and the margin on every invoice. Employees noticed the shift in tone at the executive level. Daniel now requested her input before finalizing vendor contracts, forwarding spreadsheets with full projections instead of summaries. Claire adjusted her approach as well, focusing on public relations initiatives and charitable events that aligned neatly with the newly formalized foundation. Outwardly, cooperation had replaced urgency. Inwardly, Margaret observed with careful neutrality. One afternoon during a board meeting, Daniel proposed accelerating a distribution agreement with an out-of-state supplier, citing short-term gains that would boost quarterly earnings. The proposal included a clause that limited oversight during the initial transition period. Margaret asked a single question about risk exposure and warranty liability, her voice even, her expression unreadable. The room fell quiet as the operations manager admitted that due diligence was incomplete. Daniel hesitated, then conceded that further review was advisable. It was a small moment, but it carried significance. Authority had shifted from assumption to accountability. Later that evening, Claire called Margaret directly, her tone unusually warm, suggesting that perhaps they could host a family dinner to demonstrate unity. Margaret agreed without hesitation. When Daniel and Claire arrived at Hawthorne Lane that Sunday, the dining room was set with the same white china and polished silverware Edward once insisted on using even for ordinary meals. Conversation remained cordial, yet layered with awareness. Claire spoke about community outreach plans, highlighting how the foundation could strengthen the company brand while serving a genuine purpose. Daniel described new compliance measures he had implemented to ensure transparency. Margaret listened, offering measured encouragement without surrendering oversight. After dessert, Daniel admitted that he had underestimated the complexity of leadership, and that the clause in the estate plan had forced him to reassess his priorities. Margaret responded that responsibility was not a punishment but a proving ground. She reminded him that inheritance was not solely financial. It was reputational. The Whitmore name represented decades of reliability to suppliers and employees alike. Later, as dishes were cleared and the evening wound down, Claire lingered in the doorway of the study, glancing at the framed photographs that chronicled the company's history. For the first time, her expression held something other than calculation. It held recognition that legacy could not be seized. It had to be earned. When the front door closed behind them, Margaret stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, aware that the test was ongoing. The clause had not fractured the family. It had clarified the terms under which trust could exist. And in that clarity, Margaret found a steadiness that no document alone could provide. Autumn settled fully over Connecticut, and with it came the annual supplier summit that Edward had once treated as both obligation and celebration. This year Daniel insisted on hosting it at the company warehouse rather than a hotel ballroom, a decision Margaret recognized as intentional. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows between polished forklifts and stacked pallets, banners displaying Whitmore Industrial Supply hanging from steel beams overhead. Margaret arrived early, walking slowly through the space while employees adjusted lighting and tested microphones. The air carried the scent of sawdust and motor oil, familiar and grounding. Daniel approached her with a draft of his keynote remarks, asking if she would review them before he stepped onto the platform. She scanned the pages carefully, noting references to ethical growth, community investment, and long-term partnerships rather than rapid expansion or leveraged acquisitions. When she handed the pages back, she offered only one suggestion, reminding him to acknowledge the employees by name and tenure. Leadership, she told him quietly, was visible in gratitude. During the presentation, Daniel spoke with a steadier tone than Margaret had heard in months. He credited the foundation for reinforcing the company's values, and announced new apprenticeship programs funded through its initial grants. Claire stood near the front, greeting vendors and answering questions with measured professionalism. There was no trace of haste in her manner, only attentiveness. After the formal program concluded, several longtime suppliers approached Margaret to express confidence in the company's direction. She listened to their assurances without claiming credit, aware that credibility could not be demanded. It had to be demonstrated repeatedly. Later, as twilight filtered through the high windows and guests departed, Daniel joined Margaret near the loading dock where Edward once inspected shipments personally. He admitted that the estate clause had initially felt like a threat, but over time it had clarified his priorities. He said he understood now that authority was conditional, not inherited automatically. Margaret regarded him thoughtfully, recognizing sincerity in his voice rather than calculation. She told him that stewardship required humility before it required strategy. As the last truck pulled away and the warehouse lights dimmed, Margaret sensed that the test she had set in motion was no longer about forfeiture. It was about transformation. And for the first time since the reading of the estate documents, the Whitmore legacy felt not merely protected, but evolving in a direction that honored both discipline and trust. By early winter, the company's quarterly results reflected steady growth, rather than dramatic spikes. And Margaret considered that a greater achievement than any record-breaking headline. The numbers were solid, supplier relationships had strengthened, and the apprenticeship program announced at the summit had already enrolled 12 young trainees from across Hartford County. Daniel began inviting department managers into strategic meetings instead of limiting discussions to the executive level, encouraging open dialogue about logistics, pricing, and customer retention. Claire focused on organizing community events through the Whitmore Community Foundation, coordinating scholarship interviews and visiting vocational schools that had partnered with the company. Margaret observed these developments without interfering, measuring sincerity through consistency rather than speeches. One afternoon she received an unexpected visit from Leonard Hayes, who stopped by Hawthorne Lane with updated financial summaries and a quiet smile. He explained that external auditors had completed their annual review ahead of schedule, and had noted improved compliance documentation compared to the previous year. Margaret understood the significance of that detail. Transparency was no longer a reaction to oversight. It had become routine practice. Later that week, Daniel requested a private conversation in Edward's old study, the room where so many pivotal decisions had once been made. He admitted that in the months following his father's passing he had felt overshadowed and impatient, interpreting urgency as ambition rather than insecurity. He acknowledged that the estate clause had initially angered him, but over time it had forced him to confront his own motivations. Margaret listened carefully, hearing not defensiveness but reflection. She told him that legacy was not a shortcut to authority, and that discipline protected both family and enterprise. Daniel nodded, understanding that inheritance carried expectations as real as any contract. As the year drew toward its close, the board formally reaffirmed Margaret's advisory role, not as a symbolic gesture but as an active position guiding long-term planning. The clause in the estate documents remained intact, quietly present yet no longer looming as a threat. It had reshaped the structure of accountability without ever needing to be enforced. On a clear December evening, Margaret stood at the living room window, watching snow settle lightly across the front lawn, and realized that what began as a test of greed had evolved into a recalibration of values. The Whitmore name endured not because it had been defended through confrontation, but because it had been anchored to standards that demanded integrity from everyone who carried it. The new year arrived with a sense of measured momentum rather than dramatic change, and Margaret noticed that stability carried its own quiet power. At the first board meeting in January, Daniel presented a comprehensive 5-year strategy that emphasized sustainable growth, workforce training, and conservative capital allocation. The projections were realistic, grounded in market analysis rather than optimism alone. Claire outlined the foundation's expanding partnerships with trade schools and small business incubators throughout Connecticut, explaining how mentorship programs were connecting apprentices directly with senior technicians inside the warehouse. Margaret listened as the room responded not with polite applause but with thoughtful questions, the kind that signaled engagement rather than skepticism. When it was her turn to speak, she did not revisit the estate clause or the events that had once strained trust. Instead, she addressed the broader principle of stewardship. She reminded the board that Whitmore Industrial Supply had endured economic downturns, supply shortages, and leadership transitions because it prioritized long-term credibility over short-term advantage. Her voice remained calm, but the weight of lived experience carried through every word. After the meeting concluded, Several managers lingered to express appreciation for the renewed clarity at the executive level. Margaret understood that culture was shaped less by policy than by example. Later that week she invited Daniel to accompany her on a visit to one of the Foundation's scholarship recipients, a young machinist who had recently completed his certification program. They toured the small workshop where the apprentice now worked, surrounded by precision tools and newly installed equipment funded in part by the Foundation's grant. Daniel listened as the shop owner described how stable support had allowed the business to hire 2 additional employees and expand into neighboring counties. On the drive back to Hartford, Daniel admitted that witnessing the direct impact of the Foundation reframed his understanding of wealth. It was not merely accumulation. It was influence directed responsibly. Margaret regarded him with quiet approval, recognizing that growth sometimes required perspective beyond balance sheets. That evening she returned to Hawthorne Lane and paused in Edward's study, reflecting on how close the family had come to misunderstanding inheritance entirely. The clause that once froze a room had not dismantled relationships. It had redefined them. And as Margaret reviewed the latest reports under the warm glow of the desk lamp, she realized that the greatest protection she had given her heirs was not control, but a standard that demanded they become worthy of what they would one day receive. Spring arrived gradually in Hartford, softening the sharp edges of winter and bringing with it a renewed sense of movement inside Whitmore Industrial Supply. Orders increased as construction projects resumed across the region, and the warehouse hummed with steady efficiency rather than frantic urgency. Margaret continued her routine visits, walking the aisles with a practiced eye, noting improvements in inventory management and safety protocols that Daniel had implemented without being prompted. The changes were not theatrical. They were systematic. Claire expanded the Foundation's outreach, coordinating a regional conference for small manufacturers that highlighted ethical sourcing and workforce development. What struck Margaret most was not the scale of the initiatives, but the consistency. Weeks passed without a single request for rushed signatures or quiet revisions to authority. Instead, Daniel began sending comprehensive monthly reports directly to her, accompanied by personal notes outlining lessons learned and areas for growth. One afternoon he arrived at Hawthorne Lane with a bound proposal detailing a long-term succession plan that extended beyond himself, outlining mentorship structures and governance guidelines designed to preserve accountability for decades. Margaret read the document carefully at the dining table where she had once studied far different paperwork. She recognized humility in its structure. It did not centralize power. It distributed oversight. Later that evening, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Edward's study, Daniel spoke candidly about the pressure he had felt to prove himself quickly after his father's passing. He acknowledged that impatience had nearly cost him more than control. It had nearly cost him trust. Margaret listened without interruption, then reminded him that trust was rebuilt not in a single gesture, but through repetition of responsible choices. She told him that inheritance was a privilege tied to character, not simply lineage. Daniel nodded, accepting the weight of that truth without defensiveness. Outside, the lawn that Edward once measured each spring had turned a deep shade of green, trimmed evenly by the landscaping crew Daniel now supervised personally. Margaret observed these small details as signs of something deeper. The clause in the estate documents had never needed to be enforced, because its presence reshaped behavior before consequences became necessary. As evening settled over Hawthorne Lane, Margaret felt neither vindication nor relief. She felt steadiness. The family had not been fractured by the test she set. It had been clarified. And in that clarity, the Whitmore legacy stood not as a prize to be claimed, but as a responsibility to be earned day after day. Summer settled over Connecticut with long evenings and a warmth that lingered past sunset, and Hawthorne Lane felt less like a house holding history, and more like a home carrying continuity. Margaret stood on the back patio one evening watching Daniel adjust the grill while Claire arranged plates on the outdoor table, their movements unhurried, unforced. The Whitmore Community Foundation had just completed its first full year of operations, funding 23 vocational scholarships and supporting 5 small manufacturing startups across the state. Whitmore Industrial Supply reported steady profits without overextension, and the board had unanimously adopted the succession framework Daniel proposed, embedding oversight and accountability into the company charter itself. Margaret observed these developments with the same composure she had maintained from the beginning, Aware that transformation was rarely sudden, it unfolded through repetition. The estate clause remained unchanged, quietly present within the legal structure, but it no longer felt like a looming safeguard. It felt like a boundary everyone understood. One afternoon, Daniel invited Margaret to address a group of new apprentices inside the warehouse, standing beneath steel beams that had witnessed decades of growth. She spoke about discipline, about reading every contract carefully, about building something that would outlast individual ambition. Her voice did not carry bitterness. It carried memory. She reminded them that leadership was proven not by speed but by steadiness. Afterward, Daniel thanked her publicly, acknowledging that the company's direction had been recalibrated by her insistence on integrity. Claire, standing beside him, nodded in agreement without hesitation. Later that evening, Margaret returned to Edward's study, opening the desk drawer that still held his old fountain pen and a photograph from the early days when the company consisted of 2 delivery trucks and a rented garage. She did not dwell on what might have been lost. She reflected on what had been preserved. The moment in the law office when the final sentence froze the room had not destroyed her heirs. It had revealed them. And in being revealed, they had chosen differently. Margaret understood that not every family receives such an outcome, and she did not mistake fortune for control. What she recognized instead was that clarity, delivered calmly and without spectacle, could alter the course of both business and bloodline. As twilight deepened outside the study window, Margaret turned off the lamp and walked through the quiet hallway of Hawthorne Lane. The house no longer echoed with uncertainty. It carried purpose. The legacy Edward began was not secured by dominance or fear. It endured because standards had been set and upheld. And Margaret, having given her heirs exactly what they sought, had ensured that what they ultimately inherited was not merely wealth, but the obligation to deserve it.